not
No. June is when Air Canada resumes.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bezrat Hashem.
The war is not over, unfortunately.
No, no, we know. We know. Okay. Oh, 1 second. Izzy, you came back.
It's so dark outside. It's not, somebody's not maybe like this.
David Vodianoy, we missed you yesterday.
I really wanted to be there. Just I wasn't feeling 100%.
All right, Refuah Shalema.
Yeah.
And Doug, you come for breakfast and then you stiff us? And you're
I
just
told you I was traveling this morning.
you're in the airport?
No, not yet. Yeah, my plane got delayed, but I get picked up at 7 o'clock. So
See, you should have come to Sheer. You would have still been on time. Have a good trip.
I'm
Okay.
on shoot. Thank you.
Shailas utshuvas v'haya ha'olam choshen mishpat tashlum leganonot o metaplot bisman magefat corona. So the first shaila that we're going to deal with is how do you compensate daycare teachers and babysitters during the plague of corona? Why is it specifically them? I don't know. Gananot umetaplot shene'eltzu liskor et haganim ekev magefat corona v'hora'at harishuyot. So daycare centers and babysitters are metapelet is so it's a metapelet, right? A babysitter. That they had to close their daycare centers because of the coronavirus and the government orders. Ha'im hahurim tzrichim l'shalim et scharen bizman shahagan haya sagur. Do the parents still have to pay the daycare center when the daycare center is closed? Uma hadin bahorim sheshilmu kvar merosh. And what will be the halacha of parents who paid in advance for the whole year? Ha'im haganenet tzricha lahachazir et hatashlum. Does the daycare center have to return what they paid? Okay, discuss.
I think the money has to come back, not using your services. This isn't my gate fund. What are you supposed to do?
And what about the poor ganenet?
What about all that goes for every other job? So you pay tuition for the year for school. It's the same question. Is the school supposed to return?
The school's carried on because they're
Right, so if there's no carrying on.
There's no.
The government was giving out money to private businesses. Why shouldn't they do too?
The schools will do school dues. The schools can still do online teaching. You can't do it at daycare, obviously.
Daycares were completely closed.
Yeah.
It's not like a school by Zoom.
Okay.
You change my rules.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So tshuva. The perika umnin ita. So in Bava Metzia, we learn about hiring workers. It says, Amar Rava, Haiman de Oger Aguri Ledavla, Va'asa Mitra. If a person hires people to irrigate his field, and then all of a sudden it rains, so he doesn't need irrigators anymore, Pseida de Poalim. The loss is the worker's loss. Okay? Us, meaning they don't get paid, because the guy can cancel the job. He says, I don't need you guys anymore. Ata Nahara, Pseida de Bal Habayis. If, however, the river overflows and it irrigates the field unexpectedly, so then the loss has to be the Balabayas. He still has to pay the workers. V'yahiv lahu kepol batal, but he doesn't have to pay them their full wages. He can pay them for their time, for their time, meaning that instead of time and effort, he just pays them for their time. I don't know how to we talked a little bit before how to calculate it, whether it's half of what they would normally get, but let's at least understand what's the difference between rain and an overswelling river. Va'amar Rava, Haiman de Oger Aguri Ledavla Upasak Nahara Bapalga Diyome. He says, and Rava says, if a person hires workers to irrigate his field, Upasak Nahara, and the river splits. I'm not sure what that means in midday. Ilo avid de pasik pseda de poalim. If it's something that doesn't normally split, the loss is on the workers. Avid de pasik, if it normally does split, ibnei masa, if they are of the local workers, pseda de poalim, then they incur the loss. Lav bnei mata pseda de balabayas. If they're not of the same town, the loss is on the balabayas. So we're going to explain this whole Gemara. Ubir hadvarim al pi Rashi v'harosh. Hasocher es hapolim lahashkot et sadehu ubo geshamim ve'in tzarich lahashkota. So the first case is Rashi and Rush explain. You hire workers to irrigate your field. Rain falls. You don't need them to irrigate anymore. Pseda de polimu ve'inu mishalim lahem klal. Then the loss is the workers. You don't pay them at all.
Is irrigation just watering, isn't it? Putting holes in and making sure there's other things.
No, back in the ancient world, you just had a bunch of guys schlepping buckets and pouring water all over. Ve'im hanahar, there was no complex irrigation system. I mean, you could build one, you could build aqueducts, but that's a huge expense. Ve'im hanahar ala ve'ishka utap seda de balabayas. But if the river swelled and overflowed and just did it on its own, the balabayas has to assume the loss. He's got to pay the workers. Kevin shapolim enam yodim b'minag sadeu shelifa'amim hanahar ole umashke ota, because the workers are unfamiliar with that risk. In other words, the argument is everyone who's in the watering business, like if you own a car wash or something like that, you know that it could always rain. And you assume that risk when you go into that business, that you could get an abrupt cancellation. Like, I guess anytime you run an outdoor venue for your business, you know that you could get rained out. And that's just the occupational risk that you assume. But how are the workers supposed to know that every few months the river overflows? They didn't know that. They didn't assume that risk when they accepted the job. Ahu haya yodeya v'haya tzarich lahatnoti mahem. If the balabayas is aware of that, and he should be, because he's he's had this experience with his river that he lives nearby, so then he should have stipulated with them that I'm hiring you on the condition that if the river swells, I can send you home. The kevin shelo hitna yishalim lahem scharam, and because he didn't make that condition, he has to pay their wages. Ach lo kol scharam ela kapoel batel, but he doesn't have to pay the full amount. He could pay like a poel batel, meaning that since they didn't have to exert themselves. V'chein im pasak hanahar. So this is the last case that was a little bit vague. If the river stops, not that the river splits, but the river stops flowing, it dries up. And that happens with some bodies of water, right? Even the Jordan River occasionally dries up. So the river dried up, and that was the river that the workers, what do? They go schlep to the nearest body of water, and they scoop up water with their buckets. Well, if there's no water in the river, they can't do their job, and they're not able to irrigate. Im ein darko shel anar livsog, lo haya alav lahatno pseda depoalim. If it's not something that normally would happen, it's never happened before, and it hasn't happened in 100 years, and all of a sudden it happens now, so then you can't blame the balabayas, right? It's not his fault that the river dried up, and therefore the workers have to assume the loss because the balabayas hired them in good faith.
It also didn't happen overnight.
Sometimes it could happen overnight. Sometimes it could, sometimes not. The imdarko lifsok lifa'amim, but if it sometimes does dry up, and it's something that's anticipated, imha po'alim b'nei ha'ir, hareyadu is hamitzias, the kevin shalohitnu pseda depoalim. So if the workers live in the area and they're familiar with the rivers every once in a while drying up, since they didn't stipulate this as part of their contract, they assume the risk, just like rainfall. And therefore, if it does dry up and they can't do their job, they have to assume the loss. V'im einam b'nei ha'ir pseida de balabayis. But if they don't, if they're not locals and they don't know what's going on, so then the loss has to be assumed by the balabayis. Kevin shehu yada es hametzius v'hem lo yadu v'hayolo lahasnos v'yishalim lehem scharim kapol batal. Why? Because since they were not familiar with this river, they assumed it would always be available for them to irrigate. And the balabayas should have made that stipulation with them that I'm hiring you on the condition that there's water in them hills. So then the balabayas has to assume the loss because he didn't stipulate it, and therefore he has to pay them like a pole bottle. It's sort of curious why the swelling of the river doesn't have that. It depends if they're local or not. I don't know why. Okay. Anyway, I guess maybe a swelling river is not as common, so that even if you're local, it's something that's totally unanticipated. But a drying up river is much more common. Now, uchlala de milsa kasaf harash, she'im shnehem yalu lahalos bedaitem she'iyah ones o sheshneim lo yadu, tamid hu pseida depolim. So what are we extracting from this Gemara? What we learn from this Gemara is a general rule that if both the employer and the employee know that there's an inherent risk in assuming in entering into a work contract, okay, you both of you could have anticipated it. Tamid hu pseida depolim. Then the worker has to assume the loss. The employee has to assume the loss because implicitly when he accepts the job, he knows that the job could get canceled. Virak im balabayis yada v'hapol im lo yadu upseida de balabayis umishal nekapol batal. It's only if the employer was aware of the risk and the workers were not aware, then the employer has to assume the risk. So let's say, like Moshe, you have a business and you know that the guy who runs your warehouse has been having some health challenges, but you hire a bunch of people without telling them that there's a 25% chance that the warehouse is going to be shut down because of this issue or because of some other issue. Let's say the whole grid has had electrical issues and they may not be able to work, but you didn't disclose that to them. So therefore, if it does taka shut down and they can't work, they shouldn't be penalized for it. You have to give them their wages. V'chein kasav hatur shela'olam lo yitchayev balabayis ela imkein hayu yodeya v'hapoel lo yada. That the balabayis is only going to be liable if he knew of the risk involved that they may not be able to work and they did not know. Avalim shnehem yodim o shnehem einam yodim hapoel mafsid v'chein kasav arama. But if both of them knew about the risk, or neither knew about the risk, okay, so then the poel is the one who assumes the loss, because I guess it used the principle of hamotzi mechaver olav haraya. In other words, you're trying to get me to pay you for something that I had no idea could possibly cancel the contract, nor did you have any idea. So you can't obligate me to pay you. V'chein hasocher malamid livno dino kisocher sapoel. Now, when you hire someone to educate your child, so it's like you're hiring an employee. But let's say a person hires a malamed for his son, and the child gets ill. If it's not anticipated that the child should get ill, so the malamed has to assume the loss. Or let's say the child does have a pattern of getting sick because he's got some kind of chronic illness, God forbid. Okay. But the Malamed had already accepted the job, knowing the kid, knowing of his chronic illness. So, and he's being paid by every hour that he teaches. He assumed the risk because he knew that there would be days that the child would not be able to learn. V'rak im shchiach sheyechale v'hamalamed eno makiro tzarach l'shamim lo scharu. It's only if the malamed is not local, he doesn't know the kid, and the father hires him without disclosing to him that there are going to be times when my child's not going to be well enough to meet you, that the tutor or the malamed can say, I'm sorry, that's not fair. You didn't disclose to me. It's like, it's one thing if it happens once in a blue moon, but if every week your child is out, let's say 2 out of 5 times because he's got this chronic illness, and I've already committed to you my time, then it's not fair that you didn't disclose this to me, that I shouldn't be paid. Because the father knew and the teacher didn't know. V'chein pasak maharam b'tshuva, v'chein kosav harash b'shem Rabbeinu Yoel, v'chein pasak hashulchan aruch. And all of these poskim, including the Shulchan Aruch, rule that way. Okay, so this is a fascinating rule, right? In other words, who should have known? If the worker should have known, he's not entitled to compensation. If he had no way of knowing, and the balabayas knew, then the balabayas has to pay him.
So Corona, no one knew nothing.
So Corona was totally unanticipated. It was unprecedented. That's what everyone said, right? And so let's see. The Amnam Bishut Maharami Rottenberg Kasav Shebchala Hababali don't tell is called Scharo. He says Maharami Rottenberg adds another interesting twist. He says, what if the teacher gets sick and he can't teach? He's still entitled to compensation. Kamo Eved Ivri Dekaimelan Bikidushin Shimchalo Shalosh the Eved Shalosh Eno Chayev Lahashlim. Sorry, the Ovad Shalosh Eno Chayev Lahashlim. That the Gemara in Kedushin says that if the slave was sick for 3 out of the 6 years, and he could only work for 3 out of those 6 years, then he doesn't have to make up those years when he gets better. V'chol poel shehasacher atzmo lizman dino ke'eved ivri vein sarach lahashlim v'notel kol scharo. Any worker that was hired for a finite period of time, and he becomes physically unable to complete the task, he's entitled to his full compensation, because that was not something he could control. That's a very liberal shita, right? But Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos says, Tosfos says that there's an inherent difference between an Eved Ivri, where the Torah makes special accommodations for a slave, versus an employee who cannot work, even though it's not his fault that he can't work, but it's also not the employer's fault that he can't work. So the employee is not entitled to compensation for sick days. And it's an interesting thing in labor law, right?
We have it in contracts with our employees that if you're allowed X amount of sick days per year, anything above that you don't get paid. Then what do you do about people who are paid by the hour?
Right.
Regular employees who get paid by the hour. If they
Right.
don't show up, they don't get paid.
That's right.
Work, they get paid.
Ontario has their own laws, don't they? About that.
Yeah. With sickness and with like COVID, there's two basically, after COVID, there's tons of litigation on 2 fronts. One was the contract frustrated because COVID rendered the ability of people to work, right, impossible. Because the law was you couldn't go out and be in people and all that. So they argued that the contract was frustrated through an event you had no control over that rendered it impossible to comply with to fulfill your contract. So common law, and there's also legislation in Ontario, Frustrated Contracts Act, that says then the contract, no, it's not enforceable, finished, right? The other concept was some people had what they call force majeure clauses in their contract, construction contracts in particular, where it says if things like acts of God, weather, whatever like this, riots, insurrection, war comes, it basically is a force, it's a major force that essentially makes the contract unenforceable for a period of time. And then after that, the contract terminates. So it has to be there for a reasonable period of time. COVID was there for years. So people that had these clauses scrambled to try to fit COVID into it. But none of the force majeure clauses had COVID or anything like, some of them had epidemics in there as an act of God or something like that. They were lucky because it was an epidemic, so it fit. But if you didn't have epidemic, then you're trying to say, well, it's the same as, thunderstorms and, earthquakes and other acts of gods which were stipulated, but it didn't fit. And if it didn't fit, it didn't apply. So a lot of people couldn't rely on force majeure clauses, basically.
Yeah. So my son was supposed to get married. My son Zeke was supposed to get married March of 2020. Okay, and he did. But they were supposed to get married in Montreal, where my daughter-in-law is from. And then COVID hit, and he was able to get her to fly to LA at the last minute. She got on like the last flight before they closed the border. And they ended up getting married in a small little venue in somewhat like an Airbnb backyard in Malibu. And I couldn't even be there. We weren't able to fly. And so the question became, so all of the catering venue was just canceled, and that was it. The only person who gave me a hard time was the musician who I had hired, and he expected me to pay him for his lost work because I was canceling the event. And I said, what are you talking about? No one can do this. How are you? He said, so then he said, I'm making a wedding for my son. And so I said, okay, I'll send you some tzedakah, but it's not fair for you to expect me to pay you.
We'll show up and play the music. And play.
Yeah,
I won't be able to.
right.
Well, there were hundreds of lawsuits, small claims court or otherwise, where people lost their deposits, they lost this, catering, wedding halls.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Tons of litigation, and I don't know how they all fared, but
Did
All right.
you send him money?
I did send him money just because I had Rahmanis on him, but I wasn't happy with the position that he took. Anyway, all right, lesson learned. Okay.
Next time Corona comes, you'll know better.
Yeah. I'm such a sucker, but that's it's everyone has a different attitude towards money. I'd rather just get rid of the money and make shalom. Okay. Anyway, Uvitshuvas Maimon is what?
I'll take it.
I'm like Joby, but we're both bad businessmen. Okay. All right. Uvitshuvas Maimon is Kasav Shagam Maharam Chazarbo. So it's interesting because in a later sefer, Chuvas Maimonides, he writes that the Maharam retracted his psak, even though the Maharam had originally said that if a person gets sick, he's entitled to full compensation no matter how long he's off. He actually retracted. Upasa kehatos v'shapol shenenas v'lo avad eino makabel escharo. He writes that if a worker is unable to work, he is not entitled to payment. The Rama actually brings this. If a worker cannot work, he's not entitled to compensation. The only exception is an Eved Ivri, because he sold himself into slavery, and it was basically all of the payment to the Eved Ivri, so to speak, was given at the moment that he indentured himself for 6 years. So basically, since that was already, so to speak, paid out by the master up front, so you can't say that he's, I gave you 6 years as best as I could, and you paid for it already. Whatever I was able to work, fine. And if I couldn't work, I couldn't work. But that's only when you pay in full in advance for a service, right? V'chein pasak harama v'ayin b'shach sham. U'mikol makom lahalacha hadavar barur shebechol oines she'ira v'hapoyel lo asa es malachto inu notel schar. Bottom line is lahalacha, if a worker was hired to do a job and he wasn't able to do it, for whatever mishap occurs, he is not entitled to compensation. The only exception is when the employer who hired him knew that this mishap there was a possibility that it could occur, and the worker was unaware. That's what you learn from the case of the river. The Choshen as we explained above. Vihine, hamagefa v'horat harishuyot liskor et haganim hi oines shekulam lo yadu mimenu. The coronavirus and the forced government closures was something that nobody anticipated, nobody thought was going to happen. Va'af adam lo hela oto al dato. Ulefi ha'amar b'chayagavno hu b'seidet depoyel ve'ein sarach l'shalem lo klal. And as a result, a worker is not entitled to compensation. So the daycare center is not entitled to compensation because it's not something that the employer, meaning the parents, could have anticipated. Okay? Umikol makom. With that said, yesh ladun bazeh. We still have to deliberate. Keven shahamagefa hi makat medina va'achasher yuvuar lahalon be'ezrat Hashem. There is a unique category called makas medina, a communal or societal plague, okay, as we'll see momentarily. Similarly, we also have to deliberate if a person paid up front, whether he's entitled to a refund or not. We still haven't figured that out yet. So now we're going to go to our next section. Makas medina b'schirus karka. The Perek HaMekabel Tanan. Now let's go to another Gemara in Bava Metzia. There's a Mishnah that states, HaMekabel sadeh mechavero ve'achla chagav onishtafa. If I take a field from you and for a certain amount of compensation, meaning that I'm going to rent this field so that I can harvest the crops, I could be a sharecropper, so I'm going to give you a percentage and I'll keep a percentage. And lo and behold, before I have a chance to harvest, the entire field is consumed by locusts or a blight, which, an agricultural blight could be, what is it, like the tomato plague or potato plague and whatever it is. Imakas medinahi minakalo min chikuro. So if it's something that strikes the entire region, it's not local to my field, so then the sharecropper has to take a reduction in his, we'll see. I think that's menakalo b'schir. So yeah, the sharecropper does not have to pay. Im eina makas medina, ein menakalo min chikuro. But if it's not a communal blight, it's only his specific field, so the worker does not get a discount. In other words, he's still going to have to pay for the whole thing. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im kibla himenu b'maos, ben kach uven kach eno menaka lo mechikuro adkan. And Rabbi Yehuda says, if the worker who's renting the field stipulated a certain dollar amount, a cash amount, that he's going to owe for the working of the field, so then either way he cannot deduct. He's got to pay what he contractually obligated himself to. But v'kaimelan kechachamim shafilu im socher es asada b'maos. We paskin like the chachamim that even if the sharecropper committed himself to a certain dollar amount of what he would pay for the rental of the field, but if it was a communal societal plague, then the sharecropper is entitled to reduce that amount that he owes. And that's how the Rambam, the Tur, and the Shulchan Aruch all paskin. V'chein mevur b'gemara da'afal pisha hamekabel mechavero beis hashlachim v'yovesh hamayon eino. That's a typo. Minakelo mechikuro. That if a person accepted let's say, a field that is self-irrigating, okay, because it has a wellspring embedded within the field. And all of a sudden, the wellspring dries up, and he can't do the cultivation of the field that he wanted to do. He committed to pay a certain amount for it, but now he can't get the yield that he was anticipating. He's not allowed to deduct that. He made a commitment. But in Yovash Hanahar Hagadol, the Makas Medinahi, and it's because that's local to that one field. But if the entire city's river dried up, so that it's a regional deficiency, so then the worker is entitled to say, I don't have to pay you. Okay, so we'll have to continue this Amir Tzashem tomorrow. Okay, we'll review and then we'll go weiter. Okay, have a great day, everybody. So this is a little bit more complex, as you can see.